Check, 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 check. Chapter 69, Poetry, Introduction. The spirit in which the great poets have read their predecessors differs remarkably from the attitude toward the past which prevails in other fields. The philosophers and scientists frequently feel assured that they can improve upon their predecessors. The poets, for the most part, wish only to do as well. Virgil's admiration for Homer, Dante's accolade to Virgil, Milton's praise of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides as the three tragic poets, unequaled yet by any. The tributes which Cervantes and Fielding pay to the poets of antiquity, these testify that there is no battle between the modern and the ancient books of poetry. Contemporary novelists and dramatists, especially those who are proud of their innovations in the forms or materials of poetry, may constitute an exception, but they would still be the exception to a rule which can be verified for almost all the great books of poetry. Part of the reason for such unusual accord may be that in the tradition of the great books, one book enjoys the unique distinction of having founded the science of poetry. More than that, it seems to have gained from the poets a large measure of approval and even adherence to its principles during a period of more than 2,000 years. Not that Aristotle's Poetics is without sources. They exist in Plato's comments on the kinds of poetry and Aristophanes' critical weighing of Aeschylus and Euripides, and of course in the original inventions of Homer and the great dramatic poets, both tragic and comic. Not that the acceptance of Aristotle's theory of poetry is unaccompanied by some dissent, as for example in Fielding's quarrel with the rules about the unities of time and place. But Fielding, like Cervantes, who is another close student of the Poetics, more frequently adopts than rejects Aristotle's basic insights. His most rebellious protest that the originality of creative genius cannot be bound by the laws of art or held accountable by any established critical standard would certainly receive sympathetic consideration from the man who formulated the rules of poetry and its measures of excellence by the study of the productions of Greek genius. One way in which later poets have expressed their disagreement with the Poetics confirms Fielding's insight. Those who have violated its rules and yet produced great poems have been men of exceptional genius. Where the genius has been lacking to create new forms, the violation of the rules has usually resulted in formlessness. But it is not only in the creative work of the poets that Aristotle's principles have been put to use and tested. His influence also appears in the comments which the poets make on the nature and purpose of poetry. The terms and distinctions of the Poetics are reflected in the writings of Dante, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Goethe, and Melville, as well as in many essays and criticism from Horace and Demetrius to Boccaccio, Boileau, Dryden, and Pope. Socrates once complained of the wisdom of the poets. Those whom he asked about their poetry were tongue-tied. They finally resorted to the mystery of inspiration or the inscrutability of genius. There is hardly a person present, he tells his judges in the Apology, who would not have talked better about their poetry than they did themselves. The poets of a later age through benefit of Aristotle, better were better able to discourse analytically of their art. If we turn from the poets themselves, or rather from their poems, to the analysis of poetry by poets or others, we find a number of major issues on what poetry is and on the end it serves. The tradition does not seem to be either unified or harmonious. Basic disagreements begin with the ancients. On the question, for example, whether the poets have the same obligation to speak the truth and the same kind of truth as do philosophers or scientists, Plato and Aristotle seem to be opposed. On the question whether the art of poetry lies in its use of language or is primarily the craft of fiction, Aristotle's Poetics and Horace's Art of Poetry represent the opposite answers, which have been points of departure for divergent discussions of poetry throughout the whole tradition of Western thought. With regard to the second of these two questions, it may be wondered whether we are in the presence of the sort of disagreement which requires us to take one side rather than the other. The fact that Aristotle, in his Rhetoric, writes about poetry in a vein contrary to the theory he advances in his Poetics would suggest the possibility of different but inconsistent points of view about poetry. Unless Aristotle unwittingly contradicts himself, the rhetorical consideration of poetry is simply a different way of conceiving what is poetic. In the Advancement of Learning, Bacon records this difference in the meaning of poetry, which had become traditional by his time. He treats it, moreover, as the sort of difference which does not require the rejection or either alternative as incorrect. Poetry, he writes, can be, quote, taken in two senses, in respect of words or matter. In the first sense, it is but a character of style, and belongeth to the arts of speech, and is not pertinent for the present. In the latter, it is, as hath been said, one of the principal portions of learning, and is nothing else but feigned history, which may be styled as well in prose as in verse. When Bacon says that the conception of poetry is as a literary style, as an art of writing in verse rather than prose, is not pertinent for the present, he does not reject that alternative entirely. He merely postpones it for the later section of his work, in which he treats of grammar and rhetoric. The other alternative, poetry as feigned history, is germane to his present consideration of the kinds of learning. Just as Aristotle does not set his rhetoric against his poetics on the nature of poetry, so Bacon does not exclude one of these conceptions in favor of the other when he observes how different are the principles and considerations appropriate to each. These two points of view about the nature of poetry are not always treated in this way. Sometimes one or the other is taken as the primary, or even the only way of approaching the subject, and then a genuine issue ensues, either with those who take the excluded point of view, or with those who find it possible to embrace both. The Alexandrian and Roman critics seem to create such an issue by considering poetry largely in terms of style. Modern criticism, especially since the beginning of the 19th century, goes even further in the direction of identifying poetry with verse. When Wordsworth discusses the art of poetry in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, he is concerned largely with its language. His definition of poetry as emotion recollected in tranquility indicates his emphasis upon the lyrical aspect, or even narrative poetry. When Edgar Allan Poe writes his Poetic Principle and Matthew Arnold his essays in criticism, each is concerned almost exclusively with lyric poetry, with that kind of poetry which is written in verse rather than prose. The poet tends to become more and more a composer of verses, so much so that the free verse movement can appear to be a great revolution in poetry. And the brothers Karamazov, Smirdakov says, poetry is rubbish. At Maria's protest that she is very fond of poetry, he adds, so far as it's poetry, it's essentially rubbish. Consider yourself. Whoever talks in rhyme. Just as the word art has come in popular usage to mean only painting and sculpture, so its sister word poetry has also narrowed in significance. Contemporary readers who are accustomed to think of poems as lyrics and of poetry as verse may be surprised to learn that according to the significance of its Greek root, the word poetry can cover all the forms of art or human productivity. They are just as likely to be surprised by the reference to novels and plays written in prose as poems. Yet, in the tradition of the great books, novelists like Cervantes, Fielding, and Melville call themselves poets. The great books consider poetry primarily as narrative rather than lyrical, as story rather than song. This does not mean that they exclude the other consideration of poetry. Fielding, for example, says in one place that poetry demands numbers, or something like numbers, i.e., meter, but for the most part he insists that the art of the novelist or romancer lies mainly in the invention of good stories, not in the mastery of rules of prosody, which apply only to poems of the lyric sort, written in verse. Speaking of the sweet influence which melody and rhythm by nature have, Plato may observe what a poor appearance the tales of the poets make when stripped of the colors which music puts upon them and recited in simple prose. But for Plato, as for Aristotle, the poet is a teller of tales, either in prose or in verse. Aristotle does not ignore the devices of language. In the third book of the Rhetoric, where he considers problems of style and all sorts of compositions, he distinguishes poetic from prosaic writing, and in the Poetics also he devotes a few chapters to style. But when in the latter case he deals with the language of poetry, he is not concerned with the style of any sort of composition, but only of dramatic and epic narratives, except for a brief mention of the form of verse known as the dithyramb. Aristotle does not discuss the isolated lyric as a kind of poetry. He treats song and spectacle merely as embellishments of the drama. In the Poetics, his emphasis is not upon the devices of language or the sentiments of the poet, but upon the construction of plot, the development of character, the diction and thought of the characters. In short, upon the subject matter of the poem, rather than upon the feelings of the poet and the eloquence with which he expresses them. Because he regards plot as the soul of tragedy, and by extension, the primary principle of all narrative poetry, Aristotle insists that the poet, or maker, should be the maker of plots rather than of verses. He is therefore led to criticize the confusion apparently prevalent in his day as in ours, which he thinks results from identifying the art of poetry with skill in writing verse. Even when a treatise on medicine or natural science is brought out in verse, he writes, the name of poet is given by custom to the author, and yet Homer and Empedocles have nothing in common except the meter, so that it would be better to call the one poet, the other physicist, rather than poet. Just as Bacon later remarks that a true narrative may be delivered in verse and a feigned one in prose, so Aristotle says that the poet and the historian differ not by writing in verse or in prose. The work of Herodotus might be put into verse, and it would still be a species of history, with meter no less than without it. That the difference between prose and verse may affect the style of writing, but not the essence of storytelling, is a point which has wide acceptance among writers who call themselves poets, and the prologue to Meliboeus, Chaucer's host, commands him to leave off rhyming and tell a tale in prose. He might do worse, wherein there's mirth or doctrine, good and plain. Think of the history of Don Quixote as a species of epic poetry. Cervantes declares that epics may be as well written in prose as in verse. The use by Cervantes and Fielding of the word history in the title of their novels indicates the acceptance of the other point in the conception of poetry by reference to its subject matter rather than to its linguistic style. The great poets recognize that as narratives, their works resemble histories, but they also know that the stories poets tell are, in the words of Bacon, imaginary history. Just as Fielding writes at length in mock justification of himself as an historian, so Melville touches upon the plain facts, historical and otherwise, of whale fishery, lest someone scout at Moby Dick as a monstrous fable, or still worse and more detestable, a hideous and intolerable allegory. In his chapter on the Leviathan's tale, he says, other poets have warbled the praise of the soft eye of the antelope and the lovely plumage of the bird that never alights. Less celestial, I celebrate a tale. The conception of poetry as feigned or imaginary history seems to have a direct bearing on the question of the poet's obligation to speak the truth. We shall return subsequently to other aspects of the comparison of poetry with history and philosophy. For the present, we are concerned with the issue in the theory of poetry which arises from applying the standards or knowledge to the inventions of the poet. Bacon, like Aristotle, denies that such standards are applicable, though he treats poetry as a part of learning, he holds that it is only restrained in measure of words. In all other points, it is extremely licensed, and doth truly refer to the imagination, which, being not tied to the laws of matter, may at pleasure join that which nature hath severed, and sever that which nature hath joined. Kant, on the other hand, like Plato, judges poetry in terms of its contribution to knowledge. A thing of the imagination, poetry, he maintains, serves the understanding, for it conducts a free play of the imagination as if it were a serious business of the understanding. Though, quote, the poet promises merely an entertaining play with ideas, Kant continues, yet for the understanding there inures as much as if the promotion of its business had been his one intention. He achieves a certain combination and harmony of the two faculties of cognition and harmony. Of the two faculties of cognition, sensibility, and understanding. The two faculties of cognition, sensibility, and understanding, which, though doubtless indispensable to one another, do not readily permit of being united without compulsion and reciprocal abatement. In so doing, the poet, in Kant's opinion, accomplishes something worthy of being made a serious business, namely the use of play to provide food for the understanding and the giving of life to its concepts by means of the imagination. Yet Kant and Plato do not agree in their judgment of the poet. Regarding the poet's promise as a modest one, a mere play with ideas is all he holds out to us. Kant praises him for achieving more in actual performance than he promises. Plato, on the contrary, seems to think the poet promises more and achieves less. He seems to regard the poet not as assisting, but as competing with the philosopher. The reason why the poet must fail in this attempt is that he tries to do on the level of the imagination what the philosopher is better able to do on the level of reason. Both are engaged in a process of imitation. For all knowledge is imitation. But whereas the notions of the philosopher imitate the reality of the ideas, the images of the poet imitate sensible appearances, which are themselves imitations of the ideas or eternal forms. Even when it is accurate or truthful, poetry must, therefore, be an inferior form of knowledge. In Plato's terms, it is on the level of opinion, along with fancy and belief. In any case, it must submit to being judged by the same standards of accuracy as anything else which claims to be knowledge or right opinion. Imitations, he writes, are not to be judged of by pleasure and false opinion. They are to be judged of by the standard of truth and by no other whatever. The competent judge of poetry must therefore possess three things. He must know, in the first place, of what the imitation is. Secondly, he must know that it is true. And thirdly, that it has been well executed in words and melodies and rhythms. The issue concerning poetry and truth can be most sharply drawn between Plato and Aristotle, precisely because Aristotle thinks that poetry is a form of imitation, but that knowledge does not have the character of imitation at all. Since poetry is not a kind of knowledge, the same standards do not apply to both. There is not the same kind of correctness, he insists, in poetry as in politics or in medicine or any other special science. The poet's art is at fault if he meant to describe the thing correctly but failed through lack of power of expression. But if a technical error in physiology enters into his description because he meant to describe the thing, quote, in some incorrect way, e.g. to make the horse in movement have both right legs thrown forward, then, according to Aristotle, quote, his error in that case is not in the essentials of the poetic art. The poet's obligation is not to be truthful in such particulars, but to make his whole story seem plausible. Aristotle summarizes his position in the statement of his famous rule concerning the probable and the possible. For the purposes of poetry, he says, a convincing impossibility is preferable to an unconvincing possibility. Connected with the issue concerning the kind of truth to be expected from the poet is the controversy over the purpose of poetry, to instruct or to delight, or to do both. This in turn relates to the moral problem of the influence poetry can have on human character or virtue, and to the political problem of the regulation of poetry by the state, or the right of poetry to be free from such censorship. It is not surprising that Plato, conceiving poetry as he does, should banish poets from the ideal state described in the Republic, or that he should lay down specific regulations for the content of poetry in the laws. At the opposite extreme are those who, like Milton and Mill, attack the principle of censorship itself as applied to poetry as well as to other forms of communication. But the traditional defense of poetry, in essays bearing that title, from the pen of Sidney and Shelley, or in the writings of Chaucer, Montaigne, and Cervantes, usually tries to answer Plato by praising poetry as an instrument of moral instruction as well as of delight, waiving the question of its effect upon morals. Some, like Adam Smith, answer the sort of criticism Augustine levels against pagan poetry and theatrical presentations by holding the theater to be a legitimate, a lawful, even a necessary means of recreation. Yeah, because we all know St. Augustine liked to party. We know that from his Confessions. Some of these issues touch on considerations dealt with in other chapters. The problem of censorship is discussed in the chapters on art and liberty, and the theory of imitation as applied to the arts in general, useful as well as fine, is discussed in the chapter on art. Here we are concerned with the bearing of that theory upon the nature of poetry. The difference we have observed between Plato and Aristotle concerning imitation itself does not seem to affect their use of this notion in treating works of fine art, and more particularly poetry. What Hamlet tells the players is the purpose of their play. Quote, to hold as it were, as 'twere, the mirror up to nature. Aristotle says, is the aim of such arts as poetry, sculpture, painting, music, and dance, which give both instruction and delight through imitation. Within the sphere of the fine arts, the distinction of poetry from the others is usually made in terms of the medium of imitation. Poetry, according to Aristotle, imitates through the medium of language. Painting and sculpture through lines, planes, colors, and shapes. Music through rhythm and harmony. Whether Aristotle's statement that the objects of imitation are men in action applies to poetry alone or to all the fine arts is a question of interpretation to which opposite answers have been given. Some commentators seem to think that human action as the object of imitation specifically defines poetry, whereas music and sculpture have distinct objects as well as distinct mediums of imitation. Others hold that human action is the object of imitation, common to all the arts. However the issue is resolved, the differentiation of the kinds of poetry can be made neither in terms of the object nor the medium of imitation, but only in terms of the manner, the medium being the same and the object the same. Aristotle writes, the poet may imitate by narration, in which case he can either take another personality as Homer does, or speak in his own person, unchanged, or he may present all his characters as living and moving before us. Plato makes the same distinction, pointing out that the Homeric type of poetry combines both the discourse of the poet and the discourse of his characters in dialogue. He calls stage plays pure imitations in the sense that the author never speaks directly, but tells his story entirely through the actions and speeches of the characters, whereas the type of poetry, which he calls narrative as opposed to imitative, may combine both methods of storytelling, or may, in some extreme instances, never resort to dialogue at all. Since all storytelling is narration, and since all poetry is imitation, it seems slightly confusing to call the two major types of poetry narration and imitation, as Plato sometimes does, or narrative and dramatic, as Aristotle sometimes does. Bacon also speaks of narrative and dramatic or representative poetry. He defines narrative poetry as, quote, such an exact imitation of history as to deceive, did it not often carry things beyond probability, and dramatic poetry as, quote, a kind of visible history, giving the images of things as if they were present, whilst history represents them as past. The difficulties of language seem to be removed by other terms, which both Plato and Aristotle use to express the main distinction. The manner of storytelling exemplified by Homer, which either employs direct narration without dialogue or combines both, is epic poetry. That which uses dialogue alone is dramatic. These words, epic and dramatic, may have their difficulties too, especially for the contemporary reader, unless a number of things are remembered. First, epics and dramas may be written either in prose or verse. Second, the arts of theatrical representation are auxiliary to the art of the dramatic poet. The writing of a play is completely independent of its acting. The production of spectacular effects depending, as Aristotle says, more on the art of the stage machinist than on that of the poet. Third, epic poetry differs from dramatic poetry in other respects than the use of indirect discourse as well as dialogue. On this last point, Aristotle observes that all the elements of epic poetry are found in drama, whereas the dramatic form may include the embellishments of song and spectacle, in addition to plot, character, thought, and diction. Even more important is his distinction of the two in terms of the unities of time, place, and action, because it need not be limited at all in time and place. Epic narration may have a much more complicated plot structure, or even, as Aristotle says, a multiplicity of plots. With this understanding of the distinction between the two major types of storytelling, we can see why the great novels of Cervantes, Melville, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky should be classified as epic poems. Dostoevsky, and were apparently, that's him. So conceived by their authors, at least in the cases of Cervantes and Melville, as measured by the magnitude of its plot, its reach in time, and its scene, the whole universe, from heaven through the world to hell. Goethe's Faust, even though dramatic in manner, seems to be no less epic in its structure and proportions than the poems of Homer, Virgil, Dante, and Milton. The story of a single white whale can be epic in its immensity if the storyteller, like Melville, makes it, quote, include the whole circle of the sciences and all the generations of whales and men and mastodons, past, present, and to come, with all the revolving panoramas of empire on earth and throughout the whole universe, not excluding its suburbs. Another traditional division in the kinds of poetry is that between the tragic and the comic. This distinction is variously expressed. Fielding sees the difference in terms of the misery or happiness to which the poet brings his principal characters in the end. Speaking of tragedy alone, Milton says that it has ever been held the greatest moralist and most profitable of all other poems. In similar vein, Marcus Aurelius praises tragedy for reminding men of the things which happen to them, and that it is according to nature for things to happen so. He does not admit comedy to be of equal worth, though he does look with some favor upon the older forms of comedy, which were, quote, useful in reminding men to be aware of insolence. According to Aristotle, comedy represents men as worse, tragedy as better than in actual life. He describes the action which tragic poetry imitates as serious, adding that tragedies, through pity and fear, affect the proper purgation of these emotions. Whether comedies also arouse and purge certain emotions, Aristotle does not say, for his promise to speak more fully of comic poetry is not fulfilled in the Poetics concerning the meaning of the tragic catharsis. There are questions enough. Augustine asks, how is it that a man wants to be made sad by the sight of tragic sufferings that he could not bear in his own person? The more a man feels such sufferings in himself, the more